The day begins not with a clock, but with the soft glow of first light breaking across the fields. Long before the modern world of alarms and schedules, life in a medieval village was guided by the steady rhythm of the sun. As dawn approaches, the sky deepens into shades of gray, and the faint outline of thatched rooftops emerges against the horizon. A rooster crows, distant and insistent, calling both people and animals to stir from sleep. Inside a timber-framed cottage, the air is cool and still. A faint glow of embers flickers in the hearth, the heart of every home, waiting to be coaxed back into flame. The scent of wood smoke lingers from the night before. Slowly, the household begins to wake. Children shift beneath woolen blankets. The sound of bare feet touches the packed earth floor, and a mother's hands stir the ashes to life, feeding the fire that will warm the day's first bread. The village itself awakens in quiet harmony. A dog barks somewhere beyond the cottages, followed by the shuffle of hooves as cattle are led from pens toward the fields. Wooden doors creak open, revealing figures wrapped in simple wool and linen, carrying buckets, baskets, and tools. The world is hushed, but not silent. The chorus of birds begins to swell from the hedgerows, blending with the sound of water splashing into wooden pails at the well. Life in a medieval village was built on routine. Yet within that routine was the poetry of survival. Every detail, every task, carried weight. To rise at dawn was to greet not only the day, but the endless cycle of labor, tradition, and community. Nothing was wasted, and nothing was without purpose. Hair was tied back, sleeves rolled, tools lifted, and the day began much as it had for generations before. And as the sun finally broke over the horizon, washing the fields with pale gold, the village stepped fully into its day. For the people who lived here, every dawn was both ordinary and remarkable, a continuation of lives bound to the land, bound to each other, and bound to the simple yet profound rhythm of medieval time. In the medieval village, the day began before most of the world was fully awake. There were no clocks mounted on walls, no alarms ringing sharply in the darkness. Time was measured instead by the color of the sky, the shifting light that crept across the fields, the sounds of animals stirring in their pens. Dawn was not a single moment, but a slow unfolding. And for the villagers who lived by the rhythm of nature, it was as steady and familiar as the beating of their own hearts. The first hint of morning arrived in silence. A gray softness spread across the horizon, dissolving the stars one by one. The shapes of cottages emerged slowly from the darkness, their thatched roofs damp with dew. Smoke from the night's fire lingered faintly in the air, clinging to the thatch and drifting low across the fields. The world seemed to hold its breath in those early moments, waiting for the sun to rise. Inside one of the small timber-framed homes, the fire had nearly died during the night, leaving only a bed of glowing embers beneath the ash. The hearth was never allowed to go completely cold, for the labor of striking sparks from flint and steel was time-consuming, and the fire was the life of the house. In the half-darkness, a woman bent over the hearth, coaxing the embers back to flame. She laid thin twigs across the glow, her hands practiced and sure, until the crackle of fire slowly returned. The faint warmth spread through the single room, chasing away the damp chill of night. The air inside the cottage was heavy with scents that told the story of daily life. Smoke, wool, earth, and straw. A pot sat near the hearth, its surface darkened by years of use, ready to warm the morning's porridge. Bundles of dried herbs hung from beams, a faint reminder of summer's labor preserved for winter's need. Around the low room, figures began to stir, children shifting beneath rough blankets, a man stretching stiff muscles after the long night. The creak of wooden boards as feet found the floor. Outside, the village itself began to stir. The call of a rooster broke the stillness, sharp and insistent, answered by the bleating of sheep penned nearby. Dogs barked, their voices carrying across the narrow lanes, urging the morning forward. One by one, doors opened, releasing villagers into the growing light. They stepped out wrapped in wool cloaks or simple tunics, their breath visible in the chill air. Each carried with them the tasks of the day: buckets to fetch water, baskets for kindling, tools for the fields. The well at the center of the village became one of the first places to awaken. Women and girls arrived with wooden pails, the sound of iron handles clinking against the wood. The rope creaked as it unwound, the bucket descending into the dark coolness below. When it rose again, water sloshed against the sides, spilling onto hands chilled by the morning air. This water would serve for cooking, for washing, for the endless needs of the household. Each trip was a rhythm repeated daily, a task so ordinary that its importance was rarely spoken of but never doubted. Beyond the cottages, the fields stretched outward, their soil dark with dew. Farmers walked the narrow paths, their boots pressing into the damp earth. The outlines of oxen could be seen in the growing light, their heavy forms shifting patiently as they waited to be yoked to plows. The fields themselves were not silent. The crows had already descended, their harsh cries echoing as they searched for scraps. A boy, tasked with chasing them away, waved his arms and shouted, his voice carrying faintly through the mist. Children, though still half asleep, had their own work to do. Some carried kindling, gathering fallen branches from the edge of the forest where the trees loomed tall and dark. Others helped feed chickens, scattering handfuls of grain onto the ground, laughing as the birds darted and pecked. A girl filled a clay jug with fresh water, her small hands gripping it tightly as she carried it back across uneven ground. These tasks were not seen as burdens, but as lessons, steps into the rhythm of life that they would one day carry fully as adults. The soundscape of dawn was subtle yet alive. The lowing of cattle mixed with the crackle of rekindled fires. Hooves thudded against the earth as animals were led to pasture. The sharp ring of an axe split the silence as a man chopped wood near his cottage, the scent of fresh-cut timber filling the air. Over it all, the voices of villagers rose and fell. Greetings exchanged softly in the lanes. Instructions called across yards. The laughter of children breaking through the morning hush. Inside the cottages, meals were prepared. Porridge simmered slowly in iron pots, made from oats or barley stored carefully through the winter. Bread, baked in communal ovens the day before, was sliced and shared, its crust rough but filling. Milk was poured into wooden bowls, thick and creamy, drawn fresh from cows only moments earlier. The food was plain, but it carried the strength needed for the long hours of labor ahead. Families gathered near the hearth, the glow of fire soft against weary faces, and ate in silence broken only by quiet words as the sun finally crested the horizon. The golden light spread across the village, painting cottages and fields with warmth. Shadows stretched long across the ground, and the mist began to lift, revealing the full shape of the world once more. The roofs glistened with dew, the leaves shone with droplets, and the sky deepened into pale blue. The day had truly begun. For the villagers, this moment was both ordinary and profound. It was ordinary because it happened every day, a cycle as familiar as breathing. Yet it was profound because within that cycle lay survival. Each dawn was another chance to plant, to tend, to harvest, to build, to endure. Without these beginnings, there could be no endings. The light of dawn was not simply the start of a day, but the renewal of life itself, carried forward by hands that worked tirelessly from generation to generation. And so the medieval village stepped into its day, not with noise and haste, but with quiet purpose, each person taking up their role as they had countless times before. The rhythm of dawn was the rhythm of the village, steady, unchanging, yet filled with meaning. In every flame rekindled, in every braid tied, in every bucket drawn from the well, the story of survival was written. It was not grand, not dramatic, but it was enduring. Before the fields draw everyone outward, before the market bell calls and the forge begins to ring, the medieval day is gathered first around a circle of light, the hearth. It is the earliest sun inside the house, the little world of flame on which bread depends and water softens, where tools dry and shoes warm, where stories take their shape, and where the first voices of the morning collect themselves into purpose. Within the timber frame and daubed walls, with their pale plaster and smoke-shadowed beams, the hearth is a presence as necessary as the roof. It is not simply a fire. It is habit and heat and memory, an old red heart that keeps pulsing through every season of the year. The cottage itself is small, its floor hard and beaten smooth by generations of feet. In some homes there is but one room. In others, a sleeping loft crouches beneath the thatch, reached by a ladder rubbed to velvet by hands. The door opens low to hold the warmth, and the air smells of ash and wool, of dried herbs hanging in modest bundles from the rafters, of wood smoke that stains the wattle and daub in faint crescent moons of soot. Clay jugs stand in a neat row where the wall is coolest. A chest, stout, iron-strapped, guards the things that must not be lost: a good knife, a hemmed cloth, a coil of yarn, a twist of salt wrapped against damp. The fire is re-woken from embers, as it is every morning. A hand with practice in it stirs the gray blanket of last night's ash, finds the living red at the center, and feeds it slender twigs that catch with a whisper. The flame licks, tries the air, and then rises, taking its first breath like a child. Around the hearth the day sorts itself into tasks. A pot goes on the trammel hook, swinging from the blackened iron that curves over the flames. Into the pot, a handful of oats, a pinch of salt, yesterday's saved water, and the milk that steamed only minutes ago in a wooden pail when the cow's flanks were still warm. It is not a feast, but a certainty, and certainties are precious. The room brightens not only with firelight, but with movement. A stool is dragged closer, and a child climbs onto it to reach the table, smoothing a palm over the worn wood as if stroking the grain awake. A wooden spoon makes its slow, patient circuit inside the pot, the path familiar enough to continue even with eyes half closed. Another child, a little older, kneels by the hearth to turn yesterday's bread against the heat, coaxing from it a hint of crispness. Droplets hiss where they fall from the spoon to the stones and vanish. The sound of a log settling in the fire is a small thunder, a soft punctuation in the room's low conversation. Around the hearth, objects have their steady places. The pot is the anchor, iron-bellied and dark with use. Next to it, a skillet whose handle wears the fingerprint of the house, and a kettle whose rim shines where the cloth touches it each day. A peel for bread leans against the wall. A small set of tongs sits within easy reach. The poker is simple iron, but as worthy as any silver implement elsewhere, because it does what it must. It parts the coals and stirs the day along. Wooden bowls, turned smooth, with rims that hold a thumb perfectly, wait on the table. Each bears the faint map of meals gone by, oiled by years of broth and porridge, honest and clean. Breakfast is quiet work. Porridge thickens, and the smell of it becomes the first hospitality of the morning, spread through the room the way dawn spreads through the sky, gradually, then all at once. Pieces of yesterday's loaf are cut with a knife that sees more bread than anything else in its life. A dab of soft cheese, a glimmer of honey if the year has been kind, a little smear of rendered fat saved from a better day. These are riches that make their own small ceremony. There is no hurry. There is always hurry. Both truths live side by side. A father tests the porridge with the back of his spoon and nods. A mother lifts the pot to the table, wraps its belly in a cloth to keep the heat from marking the wood. Bowls are filled, hands fold briefly in the habit of thanks to the living world, and spoons begin to move. Between slow mouthfuls, The work of the day is spoken. Who carries the bucket to the well? Who cuts the faggots? Who minds the hens? Who walks the boundary of the field to see where the rain cut new rivulets in the night? Even in warmth, the hearth is a workshop. The same hook that holds the pot will later hold a bundle of damp shoes or a coil of nettle fiber to dry. A strip of linen sits close to the heat, so its edges can be whipped and hemmed without curling on a lap. A small knife shapes a peg for a loose rung on a stool. The shavings are small curls, and the fire takes them gladly when they're swept forward with the broom. The hearth sees everything. The way a boy lowers his eyes when his sister teases him. The way a woman measuring herbs counts under her breath. 1, 2, 2.5. The way a man tilts his head to listen for the weather at the door without standing up. The soundscape deepens. The fire mutters softly. The spoon touches the bowl and makes a wooden clink. A hen complains outside. The latch clicks as someone comes and goes. A draft purses the flame, and the smoke walks briefly sideways. A hand lifts to the chimney opening to read the air. When the door stands open for a moment, the cottage inhales cold and exhales the scent of porridge and singed ash. The world outside and the world within trade breath like neighbors leaning over a fence. There is a routine to care that looks simple and is not. Ash is kept in a lidded tub because ash quiets grease and scours wood. Mixed with a little water, it makes a paste that polishes the iron pot's lip until it gleams darkly. The hearthstones are swept every morning into tidy order. The broom is birch, bound tight, and it knows the corners where crumbs hide. The iron trivet is lifted, wiped with a rag that once was a shirt. In all of this tidying is a quiet pride that does not need to be spoken aloud. A well-kept hearth is a well-kept life, and in winter, it is the difference between plain comfort and plain hardship. Children grow up inside these motions. Small hands learn to respect heat by degrees, first with distance, then with the handle of the spoon, then with the curl of smoke that warns before flame does, and finally with the quick, sure movement that stirs without splashing. They learn that wood has voices, the green log that hisses, the seasoned split that sings, the twig that vanishes in a breath. They learn that water wears three faces, still in the bucket, bright in the ladle, and wild in the boil. They learn that bread begins as roughness, then becomes silk under kneading palms, then takes on a skin in the oven's dry breath. Such lessons are as important as letters. They are the alphabet of endurance. The table is not large, but it fits everyone if they sit close. The benches hold the day's plans as well as the bodies. A father's hand flattens upon the boards when he decides. A mother's finger draws a map of tasks in a circle of spilled flour and then erases it with her palm. The smallest child drums a quiet rhythm with a spoon until an older sibling stills the errant beat with a look that says we are in a house, not a barn. Under the table, the dog dreams the old dog dream of plenty. A meat bone big as a cartwheel and no one to guard it. If a crumb falls, the dream improves, light grows. The hearth is not jealous. It tolerates the sun and the sun tolerates it. On the wall, a copper pot throws back a coin of brightness. Threads of vapor rise from the pot's lid and lay themselves thin on the rafters before disappearing. The door opens again, and the damp world outside has thin fingers of mist that reach into the threshold like curious cats. Someone carries the slop pail away for the pigs. Someone else returns with a bucket of well water so cold it beads the sides instantly, wearing a skin of dew. A cloth is dipped and wrung. The table wiped in circles until the day's first stickiness is gone. Everything takes a turn in front of the fire. Gloves, a hood, the corner of a damp cloak, so that nothing leaves the house with a chill stitched into it. The fire is a clock. It measures the morning in three distinct ways. The kindling hour, when flame is quick and eager. The bread hour, when heat is steady and body deep. And the banking hour, when coals are mounded like sleeping mice under ash, so the fire will wait obediently for the evening to come home again. Between these measures, a dozen small tasks find their moment. Butter is knocked from its wooden mold and wrapped in cloth. A handful of dried apples are softened in a bowl with warm water. A pot lid is mended with a rivet hammered cold against the doorstone. A hair ribbon is replaited and tied flat, so it will not loosen when the work outside begins. The hearth keeps all these tasks within arm's length of each other. And so the house becomes a circle with the fire at its center and the family moving around it like hours around a dial. Food moves through the morning slowly. A heel of bread is sliced crosswise to make two faces that can meet the skillet with a slick of drippings. The sound is a gentle sizzle that speaks of comfort. A cabbage leaf, blanched last evening, is warmed and dressed with a pinch of salt and a memory of vinegar. A little pot, soot dark, narrow, with a lip like a pitcher's, hangs for a few minutes to heat the broth that will fill a flask for later. The flask will go to the fields with the men and come back with a new scar somewhere on its side. Each mark a testament to usefulness, not carelessness. In a medieval village, children were never far from the rhythm of work. Their days were not filled with idle play, though laughter and games were part of life. Instead, from the moment they could walk steadily and understand instructions, they became woven into the fabric of household labor. Childhood, in that world, was not a separate stage of freedom and leisure as we imagine it now. It was preparation, gradual apprenticeship to survival, a steady training in the endless cycle of tasks that kept families fed, clothed, and sheltered. And at the center of this training were the chores that filled each day, from dawn to dusk, season to season. The morning began early for children, just as it did for their parents. They woke on pallets of straw, rubbing sleep from their eyes, blinking at the glow of the hearth as the first tasks were assigned. A boy might be handed a small bucket and told to fetch water from the well, his bare feet padding along the cold earth, the rope creaking as he lowered and raised the heavy pail. A girl might be asked to gather kindling, her small hands grasping sticks from the pile stacked near the cottage or from the hedgerow beyond. These were not heavy labors, but they mattered. Water and firewood were as necessary as bread. And for children, each trip, each bundle, was a lesson. This is how the house lives. This is how the family endures. As the village awakened fully, children's tasks multiplied. Animals needed tending, and younger hands were often sent to help. They scattered grain for chickens, laughing as the birds darted and pecked, their feathers flashing in the morning light. They guided geese from pens toward pasture, shouting and waving their arms in mock authority, while dogs snapped playfully at the stragglers. Calves had to be watched carefully, and boys were sometimes set to guard them from wandering too far or from drinking too greedily from their mothers. Each animal represented food, wealth, and survival, and so even a child's watchful eyes carried weight. Inside the cottage, chores continued. Girls brushed floors with bundles of twigs, sweeping away the dirt tracked in by boots. They stirred pots, stirred the fire, and stirred younger siblings who needed to be washed, dressed, and kept from mischief. Boys fetched tools, carried messages to neighbors, and ran errands across the lanes. Their feet learned every stone of the village paths. Their eyes became sharp in recognizing the difference between play and work. To them, a stick could be a sword in a moment of game, but when given by a father, that same stick became a tool to prod cattle or to carry across a shoulder with a load of herbs. Childhood blended seamlessly with duty. It was never one or the other, but always both. The chores shifted with the seasons. In spring, children helped with planting. They carried baskets of seeds, scattering them carefully into furrows while older hands covered the soil. They guarded fields from birds, shouting and clapping, waving rags tied to sticks to keep the flocks away from the fragile shoots. In summer, they gathered berries and herbs, filling their small hands with treasures from hedges and meadows. learning which leaves healed wounds and which should never be touched. They carried water in clay jugs to the edges of fields where men and women bent to harvest hay. They learned that labor was not only strength, but also patience, a willingness to do the small things again and again until the larger work could succeed. Autumn brought heavier tasks. Harvest meant all hands, and even children carried bundles of grain or held baskets steady as sheaves were stacked high. They picked apples from orchards, plums from branches, nuts from the forest floor. Their laughter mingled with the rustle of leaves, but beneath the joy was knowledge. This food would see them through the winter. Each apple placed in a basket, each nut cracked and stored, was a lesson in preparation. Winter itself brought another rhythm. Children helped spin wool, holding skeins taut while mothers twisted thread. They gathered snow for water when the well froze, broke ice from troughs for animals, carried straw into barns to keep livestock warm. In the dim light of short days, they sat by the hearth learning how to mend, patch, and shape. The seasons were a teacher, and chores were the classroom. Clothing was another task in which children played their part. Wool needed to be washed, carded, and spun. Flax had to be combed and prepared for weaving. Even small fingers were useful in these processes. A girl might spend hours untangling threads, her patience tested, while a boy might help pound fibers into softness. These were not glamorous tasks, but they were essential. A loose seam, a hole in a cloak, could mean cold and sickness. Every stitch mattered. Children learned this truth early, not from lectures, but from the steady repetition of work that produced warmth and protection. There were, of course, moments of play woven into the labor. Children turned chores into games, racing each other to fetch water, balancing buckets on their shoulders as if they were soldiers, building small forts of sticks while gathering firewood. Their laughter echoed down the lanes. Their energy turned duty into joy. Yet even this play was not without purpose. Through it, they learned balance, coordination, endurance, and cooperation, skills that would serve them as adults. To the modern eye, their games might look rough or simple, but for them, it was a way to transform necessity into delight. Older children often carried greater responsibility. A boy of 12 might be sent to watch flocks for an entire day, standing alone on a hillside with only a staff and a dog for company. He would scan the sky for hawks, the forest edge for wolves, the ground for straying sheep. His eyes grew sharp, his ears alert. A girl of similar age might be trusted with younger siblings, guiding them through chores, soothing their cries, keeping them safe by the fire. These responsibilities were heavy, yet they were given without hesitation. Childhood was brief, and adulthood began quietly, marked not by birthdays but by the chores one was trusted to perform. The unusual hairstyles of children, the rough bowl cuts and blunt fringes, carried their own symbolism within this world of chores. They were practical, hair short enough to keep from tangling in tools, from falling into food, from catching fire near the hearth. But they were also symbolic, marking children as children, still learners, still apprentices to life. When a boy's hair was cut differently, shaped more neatly, it signaled his step toward manhood. When a girl's hair was braided more elaborately, it marked her movement toward womanhood. Even hair spoke the language of chores, signaling who was still bound to the simple tasks and who was ready for greater ones. Evenings brought chores of their own. Animals returned from pasture and needed feeding. Tools had to be cleaned and set in order. Water was fetched once more, wood stacked by the hearth for the night. Children moved through these tasks with tired but steady hands, their small bodies carrying more weight than their years might suggest. Afterward, they sat by the fire, listening to stories, mending small items, or simply resting. Their day had been full, but it had also been formative. Each chore done was another lesson in belonging, in survival, in the quiet strength of community. The memory of these chores carried through lifetimes. Adults who bent over fields or stirred pots by the fire could remember the first time they had fetched water as a child, the first time they had herded geese or held a spindle. Those memories were not sentimental. They were reminders of training, proof of the continuity of life. Each generation passed the same chores to the next, and in doing so, ensured that the rhythm of the village never broke. So children in medieval villages were never idle, but neither were they joyless. Their chores gave them purpose, skill, and identity. They learned not only how to survive, but how to belong, to family, to land, to time itself. Their laughter mingled with their labor, their games with their duties, until both became inseparable. And though their tasks may seem small, a bucket carried, a broom swept, a chicken fed, they were part of a much larger whole. Each chore completed was a thread woven into the survival of the village, the endurance of a way of life that, though long past, still whispers to us through the quiet language of work and care. The true heart of a medieval village was not the cottages clustered along the lanes or the hearths that glowed within them, but the fields that spread outward in every direction, stitched together by hedgerows, ditches, and narrow footpaths. These fields were not only the source of food, but also the measure of survival. The rhythm of life itself was bound to the land, to its furrows and its seasons, to the constant labor that drew every man, woman, and child outward from the village each day. To walk into the fields was to walk into the pulse of medieval existence, a steady rhythm of plowing, sowing, tending, and harvesting that never ceased, never paused, and never allowed forgetfulness. The fields themselves stretched in open strips, long and narrow, divided not by fences but by tradition. Each family held rights to certain plots, scattered across the village lands so that no one was left with only good soil or only poor. These strips, some lying on the rise of a hill, others sinking into a low valley, were worked with the same persistence regardless of their quality. The soil was both gift and demand. It gave food when tended, but it asked for sweat, for aching backs, for hands chafed by tools, for endless patience. And so, each morning, the villagers stepped into the fields as though stepping into their own lifeblood. Plowing was among the heaviest labors, and its rhythm shaped the year. Oxen, heavy and slow, were yoked together, their breath rising in clouds as they leaned into the wooden plow. A man walked behind, gripping the handles, guiding the blade as it cut deep into the soil. Each step was measured, each furrow another line written into the earth's surface. Boys often walked alongside, carrying whips not to harm but to encourage, calling out steadying words, learning how to keep the team aligned. The creak of the wooden plow, the grunt of oxen, the crunch of soil, these sounds were the morning music of the fields. And though it was hard, relentless labor, there was also dignity in it. For plowing turned wilderness into provision, and each furrow meant bread in the months to come. Sowing followed in rhythm, seeds scattered by practiced hands into the dark cuts of earth. A man's stride determined the spacing, his swing of the arm the evenness of the spread. Behind him, another lightly brushed soil over the seeds, protecting them from birds, from wind, from chance. Children watched closely, sometimes given handfuls to scatter themselves, their small arms imitating the wide sweep of their elders. To plant was not simply to cast grain into soil, but to cast hope into the future. Each seed held promise. Each promise demanded care. The fields became a living calendar, marking time not in numbers, but in growth. Tending the fields required vigilance. Weeds sprang up with stubborn speed, and hands bent low to pull them, hour after hour, until backs ached and fingers stung. Birds descended, greedy for the tender shoots, and children shouted and waved, running along the edges with rags tied to sticks, their voices rising in chorus against the crows. Rain might soak the furrows too deeply, drowning seeds, or drought might crack the soil into parched lines. The villagers read the sky constantly, searching for signs, listening to the wind, watching the way clouds gathered over distant hills. The earth gave no guarantees. It required constant care, constant attention, constant trust that labor would one day yield enough to carry the village through another winter. The rhythm of farming was communal. Families worked their strips side by side, voices carrying across the furrows, calling greetings, sharing news, lending tools. No man or woman was fully alone in the fields. If a plow broke, neighbors helped mend it. If oxen faltered, another team was lent. This cooperation was not charity, but necessity. One family's failure could weaken the whole village, for hunger knew no boundaries. And so, though each family worked its own plots, the larger rhythm bound them together. The land was shared, the labor was shared, and the survival was shared. Harvest brought the year's greatest labor and greatest urgency. As the grain ripened and bent heavy under the sun, every hand was called to the fields. Sickles flashed in the light, their curved blades cutting stalks with steady swish. Sheaves were gathered, bound with twisted straw, stacked high in stooks to dry beneath the open sky. Children carried bundles, laughing as they staggered under loads too heavy for their size. Women bound sheaves and spread them in patterns that kept rain from soaking too deeply. Men cut row after row, their arms moving in rhythm until shoulders burned and hands blistered. The air was thick with the scent of ripe grain, the sound of voices urging one another onward. The knowledge that every hour counted as the sun lowered. Carts creaked under the weight of the harvest, oxen pulling slowly back toward the village. The barns filled, the granaries received their measure, and a quiet sense of relief spread, though it was never complete until the last sheaf was stored. Only then could the village rest for a moment, gathering in small celebrations, sharing bread made from the first grain of the new harvest, singing songs that praised not only the land but their own endurance. Yet farming was not only about grain. The fields also held beans, peas, onions, leeks, cabbages, turnips, humble crops that filled the table when bread was not enough. These were tended by careful hands, weeded, watered, guarded against pests. Children often learned their first lessons in farming by tending these smaller gardens, pulling weeds from among the beans, gathering onions into baskets, carrying cabbages back to the cottage. The rhythm of these tasks was steady, less dramatic than harvest, but no less vital. A well-tended garden could mean the difference between hunger and survival. Animals, too, shaped the rhythm of farming. Sheep grazed the hillsides, their wool providing warmth as well as food. Cows gave milk each morning, their slow eyes watching patiently as hands drew sustenance from their sides. Pigs rooted in the forest edges, turning scraps into strength. Goats climbed where cattle could not, providing milk in smaller measure. Chickens scratched in the yards, their eggs gathered daily by eager hands. Each animal required care, and that care wove itself into the larger rhythm of the fields. Children drove sheep to pasture, men mended fences, women carried pails of milk. Together, these tasks formed a cycle as constant as the turning of the seasons. Tools themselves carried stories. The wooden plow, its beam worn smooth by years of use, was not only an implement but a companion in survival. Sickles, their blades sharpened on whetstones, were passed down through families, each notch a memory of past harvests. Hoes, rakes, and spades, simple in form, were shaped by calloused hands into extensions of the body. Children learned to handle them early, their small fingers gripping handles too large, their bodies straining under weight, until in time the tools seemed to grow lighter as their strength grew heavier. These tools, humble and plain, were as vital as bread itself, for without them the earth could not be persuaded to yield its gifts. Even the sounds of the fields were part of the rhythm. The lowing of oxen, the creak of leather harnesses, the scrape of iron against stone, the rustle of grain, the calls of voices carried by wind. These were the music of farming, the background against which life unfolded. To those who lived within it, the sounds were not noise, but reassurance. Silence would have meant disaster. The steady hum of work, the constant movement of hands and tools, was proof that life endured. Evenings in the fields were marked by fatigue, but also by satisfaction. As the sun sank low, casting long shadows across the furrows, families gathered tools, called animals, and walked back along narrow paths to the village. Their bodies ached, their clothes bore the dust of soil, their hands were marked with blisters. Yet within that weariness was strength, a deep knowledge that the work had been necessary, that tomorrow would bring more, and that in the end, the land would provide. Around the hearth that evening, as porridge was eaten and stories told, the memory of the fields lingered in every muscle, in every breath. The rhythm of farming was not only work, but life itself. It was the steady heartbeat of the village, the pattern that shaped every dawn and every dusk. It was harsh and unforgiving, but it was also dignified and enduring. Each furrow cut, each seed sown, each sheaf harvested was part of a larger story, a story of resilience, of community, of humanity bound inseparably to the land. And those centuries have passed, though the fields lie quiet now or are crossed by modern roads. The rhythm still whispers in memory, the steady steps of oxen, the sweep of sickles, the voices of villagers working side by side beneath the wide, eternal sky. Not every villager walked into the furrows of the field each morning. While most hands turned the soil, there were others whose days were guided not by the plow but by the hammer, the chisel, the loom, or the spinning wheel. These were the craftsmen and craftswomen of the medieval village, men and women whose skills transformed raw materials into tools, clothing, shelter, and the quiet necessities of survival. Their labor was just as vital as the farmers, for the village could not endure on grain alone. Without tools, there was no plowing. Without shoes, no walking the long lanes. Without carts, no carrying of harvest. The rhythm of the fields might have been the village's heartbeat, but the craftsmen were its hands, shaping, mending, and building the world around them. The day of a craftsman began like all others, with the first light of dawn. He might rise in the same small cottage, warmed by the same hearth, eat from the same wooden bowl. Yet when he stepped outside, his path often led not to the wide horizon of the fields, but to the narrow doorway of his workshop. These workshops were small, often little more than extensions of cottages or sheds standing along the village lanes. Some were open to the air, their doors thrown wide to invite light, their thresholds scattered with shavings, filings, or scraps of leather. To pass one of these workshops in the morning was to hear the sounds that defined craft. The rhythmic strike of hammer on anvil, the rasp of a plane over wood, the steady creak of a loom, the hiss of water quenching hot iron. Each sound was a note in the hidden music of the village, blending with the lowing of cattle and the murmur of voices in the fields. The blacksmith was perhaps the most respected of these craftsmen, for his work touched every life. His forge was a place of smoke and fire, where iron rods were transformed into tools, nails, hinges, horseshoes, and plowshares. The heat was intense, the air thick with sparks, the rhythm of hammering unrelenting. Villagers brought him broken tools to mend, and he returned them whole, stronger than before. He shod the oxen and horses that pulled the plows, ensuring their hooves could endure the heavy soil. He crafted locks for doors, blades for knives, hooks for pots, rings for carts. His skill turned stubborn iron into obedience, and without him, the village would have faltered. Children often gathered at the doorway, eyes wide as they watched sparks leap like fireflies, marveling at how ordinary metal could be shaped by strength and flame into something useful along another lane. The carpenter worked with quieter tools, but no less skill. His workshop smelled of fresh-cut timber and resin, its floor littered with curls of shavings that gleamed like golden ribbons in the sunlight. With axe, adze, plane, and saw, he turned wood into doors that shut against the cold, tables where families gathered, beams that held roofs steady, wheels that turned the village carts. He built and repaired plows, shaping handles that fit the curve of the farmer's hand, and sledges that dragged loads across muddy ground. His work was practical, but it also carried beauty. A simple chest might bear a carved pattern along its lid, a gesture of care and pride. A cradle might be smoothed so finely that no splinter could trouble a sleeping child. In every joint and every notch, there was thought not only for strength, but for the human lives that would use the object day after day. The weaver, too, held an essential role. In cottages where looms were set up, often in the brightest corner near a window, threads stretched taut across the frame. The steady shuttle moved back and forth, the pattern building line by line into cloth that would clothe the village through summer heat and winter frost. Wool from the sheep, flax from the fields, sometimes even imported linen or rare silk for the wealthier. All of it passed through the hands of weavers who turned fiber into fabric. Spinners sat beside them, their wheels humming softly, twisting rough fibers into smooth thread. Women and children often filled these roles, their fingers nimble, their patience long. The sound of spinning and weaving was softer than hammer or saw, but no less vital. Without it, the village would stand clothed only in rags. Leatherworkers, too, shaped the village's endurance. From the hides of cattle, they cut and stitched shoes that carried feet along muddy roads, belts that held tunics in place, straps that bound carts, pouches that held coins, and gloves that shielded hands from cold and labor. Their workshops smelled of tanned hides, pungent and earthy, awls pierced, needles drew strong thread, knives shaped edges. Each item bore marks of care, the stitching tight, the seams firm, the surface polished with tallow until supple and strong. A good pair of shoes might last years. A poorly made pair might mean frostbitten toes or aching steps. The leatherworker's skill walked with every villager, unseen but always present. Potters shaped earth itself into vessels that held water, grain, milk, ale, and salt. Their wheels turned slowly, their hands wet with clay, their eyes sharp as forms rose beneath their touch. A jug for the well, a bowl for porridge, a jar for storing beans. Each piece found its way into the daily rhythm of meals and storage. Once shaped, the clay was fired in kilns, the flames painting strength into fragile forms. The village kitchen depended on these vessels, for without them, food could not be kept safe, water could not be carried, meals could not be served. The potter's work was quiet, but it was as close to the heart of life as the bread it contained. Other crafts filled the edges of village life. The thatcher, who laid reeds in neat rows upon rooftops, sealing homes against rain and wind. The wheelwright, who shaped round perfection from straight timber, ensuring carts rolled smoothly over rutted roads. The cooper, who built barrels with curved staves that held water tight, allowing ale to be stored, fish to be salted, goods to be transported. The mason, who set stones into walls and wells, whose work endured long after others had faded. Each craft built upon another, a chain of skill and labor that bound the village together. Children watched and learned. A boy might be sent to pump the bellows at the forge, his small arms aching as he forced air into the flames. A girl might wind thread for her mother's loom, her fingers raw from the endless motion. Apprenticeship began in these small acts, the gradual handing down of knowledge from elder to youth. Skills were not written in books, but in hands, in eyes that watched closely, in voices that instructed patiently. To learn a craft was to inherit a tradition, to step into a lineage that carried not only tools but identity. A carpenter's son might become a carpenter. A blacksmith's apprentice might one day hold the hammer himself. These crafts ensured continuity, survival not just of people but of skill. The rhythm of the craftsman's day was different from that of the farmer, but it was no less demanding. While farmers followed the seasons, craftsmen followed the demands of need. A plow broken in spring had to be mended at once. A shoe worn thin in winter had to be replaced before frost bit too deep. Their work often stretched into the night, the glow of a forge or the dim light of a rush candle guiding their hands. The sounds of craft continued even when the fields lay quiet, echoing through the village lanes in steady persistence. And yet, within these tasks, there was room for pride and artistry. A blacksmith might shape an iron hinge into a curve that pleased the eye. A carpenter might carve initials into a beam. A weaver might choose colors that made a pattern sing. These touches, small and often unnoticed, carried meaning. They spoke of humanity, of the desire to create not only what was useful, but what was beautiful. Even in the most practical of crafts, art lived quietly, woven into the fabric of survival. Thus, the craftsmen at work were more than laborers. They were keepers of knowledge, builders of community, makers of continuity. Their hands shaped the tools that shaped the fields, the shoes that carried the workers, the vessels that held the harvest, the roofs that sheltered the families. Without them, the rhythm of the fields would falter, the village itself would collapse. Together with the farmers, they formed the two halves of survival, one drawing food from the earth, the other shaping the world in which that food could sustain life. And so, as the sun rose and set, as the seasons turned, the craftsmen of the medieval village worked steadily at their benches, their forges, their wheels, their looms. Their labor was quieter than the plow's furrows, less visible than the harvest stacked high in barns, but it was no less essential. In their hands, raw earth, wood, wool, leather, and iron became life itself, transformed into tools, clothing, shelter, and continuity. And those centuries have passed. Though their workshops stand empty now, the echo of their rhythm still lingers, soft as the ring of a hammer, steady as the creak of a loom, eternal as the work of human hands. If the hearth was the heart of the home, and the fields the lifeblood of survival, then the village market was the place where the pulse of community beat most strongly. It was not every day that a market was held, sometimes once a week, sometimes less often, depending on the size of the settlement. But whenever it came, the market transformed the village from a quiet cluster of cottages into a place alive with motion, voices, colors, and scents. For the people of a medieval village, the market was more than a chance to buy and sell. It was the gathering of neighbors, the exchange of news, the reaffirmation of ties, the meeting of needs that could not be met in solitude. To walk into the market square was to step into the very center of medieval life. Long before the first customers arrived, the market began to prepare itself. At dawn, villagers from outlying hamlets and farms made their way toward the square, leading carts piled with goods, baskets balanced on shoulders, bundles tied with cord. The clatter of wooden wheels on stone paths, the soft thud of hooves, the creak of leather harnesses. These sounds announced that the market day had come. Stalls were erected quickly, simple wooden frames covered with cloth or reed mats to shield against sun or rain. Merchants laid out their wares carefully, arranging them in ways that caught the eye, vegetables stacked in pyramids, loaves of bread laid in neat rows, bolts of cloth folded with edges aligned, pots and jugs gleaming with fresh glaze. The square became a patchwork of color and shape, each stall a small world of its own. The smells of the market were as vivid as its sights. The sharp tang of onions and leeks mingled with the sweetness of apples and pears. Freshly baked bread released its warm fragrance, mingling with the smoky aroma of cured meats and the salty bite of fish carried in from rivers or the coast. Spices, though rare and expensive, sometimes made their presence known. The warm scent of cinnamon, the faint fire of pepper, the unfamiliar richness of saffron. These scents wove themselves together into an invisible tapestry that clung to the air, reminding all who entered that here was a place of exchange and abundance. Even if that abundance was modest by our standards, the sounds, too, filled the square. Voices rose in greetings, in bargaining, in laughter. Children darted between stalls, their giggles carrying above the crowd. A cow lowed impatiently as it was led to the edge of the market to be sold, its hooves stamping against the earth. Chickens clucked loudly from wicker cages, their feathers ruffling as passers-by peered in. Dogs barked, sometimes begging scraps, sometimes warning others to keep their distance. Above it all, the toll of the church bell might sound, marking the hour, reminding everyone that though the market seemed a world of its own, it was still bound to the larger rhythm of time and duty. For villagers, the market was a place of necessity. Few families could produce everything they needed. A farmer who grew grain might lack salt. A weaver who spun wool might need iron tools. A potter who shaped clay might need honey or leather. And so, goods flowed between hands, sometimes through coins, often through barter. A basket of eggs might be exchanged for a length of cloth. A repaired tool might be traded for a measure of grain. A child's wooden toy might be swapped for a jar of honey. These exchanges were not only practical, but personal. Each transaction carried with it conversation, recognition, a weaving together of lives. Merchants from outside the village often came, bringing with them goods that seemed exotic. Salt sellers arrived with coarse crystals that gleamed white against rough cloth. Peddlers carried small trinkets, pins, beads, mirrors, combs, that delighted children and tempted women with a hint of beauty beyond the ordinary. Sometimes traveling traders brought news as well as goods, tales of distant towns, rumors of storms on the coast, whispers of conflicts between lords. These stories traveled as swiftly as any item, passed from mouth to ear until the whole market buzzed with them. In a world without printed papers or swift messengers, the market was the village's voice to the wider world. The market was also a place of spectacle. Performers sometimes appeared, a musician with a lute or pipe, playing cheerful tunes that drew listeners close. A juggler tossing wooden balls in careful arcs. A storyteller whose voice carried, weaving tales of heroes and wonders that lifted the minds of villagers from their ordinary labors into worlds of imagination. Children clustered around these sights, their eyes wide, their hands clapping, their laughter bright. Even adults paused, smiling quietly, grateful for a moment of joy amidst the seriousness of survival. At the heart of the market stood food. Bread was sold by the loaf, its crusts crisp, its insides soft, each bite a reminder of the field's labor. Vegetables lay in heaps, carrots with their greens still attached, cabbages heavy and round, beans in small bundles. Fruit, when in season, gleamed with freshness. Apples that shone like polished wood, plums deep with juice, berries spilling from baskets. Meat was more costly, but still present. Cuts of pork or beef laid on boards, rabbits hung by their feet, poultry sold live or freshly plucked. Fish, too, arrived, their scales catching the light, their scent sharp but welcome to those who lived far from the sea. Each stall was an offering, and each purchase a small celebration of survival. Cloth was another treasure of the market. Bolts of wool in muted colors, brown, gray, green, lay folded in neat stacks. Linen, smoother and lighter, offered comfort in warmer seasons. Sometimes brighter colors appeared, dyed with plants or imported substances, blues, reds, yellows that caught the eye and suggested festivity. Needles, pins, and thread were sold alongside, small but essential items that kept clothing whole. Women examined these with care, weighing the worth of each purchase, deciding whether the family could afford a new length of cloth or must make do with patches once more. Tools, too, filled the market, iron nails by the handful, Knives of different sizes, sickles, hoes, hammers. These were not luxuries, but necessities, for a broken tool could halt work in the fields. A blunt blade could slow the harvest. The blacksmith's presence was often felt here, his wares displayed proudly, his skill evident in the sharpness of his blades, the sturdiness of his nails. Farmers inspected them carefully, weighing them in their hands, bargaining for the best price, knowing that their season's labor depended on the reliability of such simple items. The market was also a place of community beyond commerce. Neighbors who rarely saw each other in the scattered fields came together here, exchanging news, sharing advice, offering help. A woman might ask how another's child was recovering from illness. A man might inquire about the state of a neighbor's fence or the health of his oxen. Gossip flowed as freely as goods. Whispers of a betrothal, murmurs of a quarrel, laughter at some mischief done by children. These conversations were the threads that wove the village into one fabric, keeping it strong against the wear of time. For children, the market was a place of wonder. They tugged at their parents' hands, pointing eagerly at sweets made of honey, at ribbons of bright color, at wooden toys carved into the shapes of animals. Their eyes widened at the sight of animals brought for sale, calves lowing nervously, pigs squealing, geese hissing with outstretched wings. The sounds, the smells, the colors overwhelmed their senses, filling them with memories they would carry long after the day had ended as the day wore on. The market reached its height. The square was crowded, voices rising and falling in constant rhythm, goods changing hands quickly. Coins clinked, cloth rustled, animals shifted, laughter rang out. The air was thick with dust stirred by countless feet, with the warmth of bodies pressed close, with the mingled sense of food and people and beasts. It was a living, breathing thing. The market, alive with the combined energy of the village and all who came to it. Eventually, as the sun began to lower, the market slowly unraveled. Goods were packed away, stalls dismantled, carts loaded once more. Merchants counted their earnings. Villagers carried their purchases home. The square, once filled with clamor, returned gradually to silence. Only a few stray feathers, a dropped turnip, a scrap of cloth remained as reminders of the day's activity. Yet the memory of the market lingered. Families returned to their cottages with new supplies, new stories, new connections. Children fell asleep that night with visions of colors and sounds still echoing in their minds. The village market was more than a place of trade. It was the heartbeat of community, the link between isolation and connection, the moment when life expanded beyond the household and the field into something larger, more vibrant, more human. It was where needs were met, where friendships were strengthened, where joy was found amidst hardship. And those centuries have passed, though markets now hum with different goods and different voices. The essence remains the same: people gathering, exchanging, sustaining one another through the simple, profound act of meeting in a shared place. Every medieval village carried a voice of its own, a living music made not with instruments, but with the ordinary movements of survival. If one were to close their eyes and stand in the middle of the lane from dawn until dusk, the story of the entire village could be heard without a single word spoken. The sounds themselves were the chronicle of the day: the strike of a hammer, the bleat of a goat, the creak of a cartwheel, the murmur of voices woven together like threads in cloth. Each sound was small, but together they formed the great rhythm of medieval life, steady and unbroken. A harmony born not of leisure, but of necessity. The morning began with sounds that rose gently from the stillness of night. A rooster's crow was sharp and insistent, breaking the quiet like a trumpet. Dogs barked in reply, stretching their limbs and announcing the return of movement. From cottages came the muffled creak of wooden doors opening, the shuffle of feet across earthen floors, the hiss and crackle of fires coaxed back to life from sleeping embers. Pails clinked as they were lifted, Buckets thudded against the side of the well as ropes descended, and the splash of fresh water echoed upward, cool and bright. These were the first voices of the day, soft at first, then multiplying until the whole village seemed awake to children's laughter mixed with the calls of their parents. Quick footsteps pattering as they carried kindling, slower ones crunching as men walked toward the fields. From barns and pens came the lowing of cattle, the bleating of sheep, the grunting of pigs waiting for feed. Chickens cackled noisily as handfuls of grain were thrown, their wings flapping with sudden energy. Hooves clattered on stones as oxen were led from their shelters, leather harnesses creaking as they were fastened. Even the birds of the hedgerows joined, their songs rising sweet and clear into the pale sky. All of these voices, woven together, created a morning chorus that no silence could match. As the day unfolded, the sounds grew busier. From the fields came the steady rhythm of labor. The groan of a wooden plow pulling through the soil, the sharp strike of iron against stone when a blade caught on a buried rock, the calls of farmers guiding their animals. Voices carried across the furrows, low shouts, encouragements, sometimes laughter despite the work. When seeds were sown, the soft patter of grain striking soil created its own subtle rhythm. When weeds were pulled, there was only the sound of breathing, of hands moving steadily through the earth. The fields were rarely quiet, but their music was patient and low. A heartbeat spread across the land. Closer to the village, other sounds rose in contrast. From the forge came the ringing strike of hammer on anvil, a sound that carried far, sharp and commanding. Sparks hissed as hot iron met water, the quick sigh of steam joining the rhythm. From the carpenter's shop came the rasp of saws, the thump of chisels, the low creak of wood bending under skilled hands. A weaver's shuttle clicked steadily across the loom, back and forth, a gentle percussion that filled the quiet corners of cottages. Spindles whirred as wool was twisted into thread, a sound so soft it might be mistaken for a sigh, yet constant enough to fill the background of the day. The market, when it was held, filled the air with a different symphony altogether. The hum of voices rose and fell like waves. Merchants called out their wares, praising their bread, their cloth, their tools. Bargaining voices overlapped, some sharp, some pleading, some cheerful. Chickens clucked in wicker cages, pigs squealed, calves lowed nervously. The clink of coins struck hands, the rustle of cloth unfolded, the hollow knock of pottery tested with knuckles. Performers' voices, high and clear, cut through with songs or stories, drawing laughter or applause. The market was noise made into celebration, the sound of community gathered in one place. But the village was never only human voices. Nature lent its own sounds to the day. Wind moved through the thatch on rooftops with a low whisper. Trees in the forest beyond the fields groaned when gusts pressed against their trunks, their leaves rattling like distant applause. Streams gurgled steadily, their waters carrying songs older than the village itself. In summer, insects buzzed endlessly, their droning adding warmth to the air. In winter, snow fell with a hush that muffled every other sound, until footsteps across it broke the stillness with crunch after crunch. Each season gave its own voice, shaping the soundscape of life. The bells of the church or manor tower marked the passing of hours. They rang clear across the fields, reminding workers of midday rest, calling villagers to gatherings, sounding warnings when danger approached. Their tones were both comfort and command, voices of authority that everyone recognized. Between these rings, the rhythm of ordinary labor continued, but always in the background. The villagers carried the memory of the bell's sound, as though the air itself still vibrated with its echo. Midday carried different sounds from morning. Families gathered for meals, and from each cottage rose the bubbling of pots, the scrape of wooden spoons, the quiet conversation of voices resting briefly from labor. Laughter often mingled with these sounds, For meal times were not only for eating, but for sharing the events of the morning. Afterward, the village lanes grew quieter as many returned to the fields or workshops. Only the hum of insects, the occasional bark of a dog, or the faint ringing of tools disturbed the drowsy silence. Even sound had its rhythm of exertion and pause. The afternoon brought renewed vigor. Scythes whispered through tall grass, their swish marking each stroke. Grain was bundled with the rustle of stalks gathered and tied. Carts creaked under loads of hay, their wheels groaning, their axles squeaking. Children's shouts carried across the meadows as they chased birds away or helped gather loose straw. The air was filled with movement, and every movement had its sound. The thump of bundles dropped, the clatter of tools set aside, the sigh of tired voices calling to one another. Evening gradually softened the village's music. Animals were driven back to pens, their hooves thudding against the ground, their low voices filling the lanes. The clang of tools being put away echoed from workshops. The last hammers struck, the last saws rasped, the last looms clicked before falling silent. Fires crackled in hearths once more, louder now as larger logs were laid on for the night. Pots bubbled with evening meals, their lids rattling softly. Voices drifted into laughter and storytelling, carrying across the quiet lanes as families sat together, their words mingling with the glow of firelight. By nightfall, the sounds fell into hush. The dogs barked a final round before settling. A few doors closed with wooden thuds. The wind moved gently through the thatch. The owls called from the forest. The crickets took up their steady song. The village exhaled into silence, broken only by the occasional cry of a restless child, the cough of an elder, the low snore from a weary worker. The day's music had ended, leaving behind its echoes, promising that with dawn it would begin again. The sounds of the medieval day were not noise to those who lived within them. They were reassurance, proof of life continuing, of neighbors nearby, of animals cared for, of tools in use, of survival carried forward. Silence was rare, and when it came, it was often feared, for silence meant absence, disaster, or death. The music of the village, humble as it was the true language of community. Each strike, each creak, each laugh, each murmur was a syllable in a story told not with ink, but with sound. And so, to live in a medieval village was to live within an unbroken symphony of ordinary noises, each one small, but together immense. It was a world where sound carried comfort, instruction, and continuity. The roosters crow, the hammers ring, the child's laughter, the oxen's low, the looms click, the bells toll. All were voices in a single song, the song of daily survival. And those centuries have passed, though machines now fill our world with louder and stranger sounds. The memory of that simpler music lingers. In imagination, one can still hear it, the gentle hum of a village at work, a chorus of life woven from the quiet strength of ordinary people. As the long hours of labor slowly gave way to dusk, the medieval village seemed to breathe in a different rhythm. The intensity of the day, with its hammering, its plowing, its bargaining, softened into something quieter, gentler, more reflective. Evening was not a time of idleness. There were still tasks to complete, animals to tend, food to prepare, but it was a transition, a drawing inward from the vastness of fields and workshops to the smaller, more intimate circle of hearth and home. To walk through the village at this hour was to sense the shift from survival to solace, from the noise of duty to the calm of gathering. The first sign of evening was the movement of animals. Oxen, weary from pulling plows, were led slowly back along narrow paths, their hooves thudding heavily against the earth. Their breath rose in soft clouds as the cool air deepened, and their eyes, large and calm, reflected the fading light. Sheep bleated as they were herded into pens, their woolly bodies pressing close together for comfort. Goats clambered down from hillsides, their bells tinkling faintly, guiding them home. Chickens were gathered from yards, their clucking sharp as they resisted being caught, and carried into coops where they would be safe from the prowling fox or owl. The sounds of the village shifted with these movements, a chorus of bleats, clucks, low moos, and the steady voices of farmers calling, coaxing, urging. Evening was a shepherd's hour as much as it was a villager's, for the livestock that sustained the household had to be secured before darkness claimed the fields. Carts returned from distant strips of land, their wheels groaning under the weight of tools, hay, or bundles of produce. The creak of leather harnesses blended with the creak of wood, a sound as ordinary as breathing. Men walked beside them, their shoulders heavy but their pace steady, while children skipped alongside or dragged behind, too tired to match their parents' stride. The village lanes filled with these small processions, each family carrying the day's labor back toward its center. Dust clung to clothes, mud clung to boots, and the scent of earth, sweat, and hay mixed with the first hints of smoke rising once more from cottage chimneys. Inside the workshops, tools were laid aside. The blacksmith struck his final blows of the day, the ringing hammer slowing before silence settled in the forge. The carpenter brushed shavings from his bench, stacked his wood neatly, and leaned his saw against the wall. The weaver folded cloth from the loom, winding threads carefully to prevent tangles. The potter wiped his hands clean of clay and left vessels to dry overnight, their shapes catching the low glow of evening light. These closures carried their own rhythm, the rhythm of order, of preparing for rest. Nothing was abandoned. Everything was set in place so that tomorrow could begin again without confusion. The market, if it had been held, dissolved slowly. Merchants packed their goods into carts. Cloths were folded, cages lifted, boards stacked. The crowd thinned as families carried their purchases home. Loaves tucked under arms, baskets filled with vegetables, jugs sloshing with water or ale. The noise of bargaining gave way to softer conversations, the laughter of neighbors parting, the clatter of hooves moving away from the square. By the time the sun was a sliver above the horizon, the market square returned to stillness, marked only by a few stray feathers, a dropped apple, or the faint smell of fish left behind. Evening inside the cottages was centered, as always, on the hearth. Fires were rekindled with larger logs, their flames leaping higher, casting golden light across the walls. Pots were set once more to bubbling, filled with the day's gatherings. Grains simmered into porridge, stews thickened with root vegetables, sometimes enriched with a scrap of meat or a pinch of herbs. The smell of food filled the rooms, warm and comforting, carrying with it the promise of nourishment after long exertion. Bread, baked in communal ovens earlier, was cut and shared, its crust hard but its crumbs soft, each piece more precious than gold. The clatter of wooden spoons and bowls formed the quiet percussion of supper, a music that every cottage knew. Families gathered close around these meals, their faces illuminated by the glow of firelight. Words were exchanged, reports of how the fields fared, which tools had broken, how the animals had behaved, what news had reached from neighbors or travelers. Children repeated the stories they had heard at the well, adding their own embellishments. Parents laughed softly or nodded gravely, correcting when necessary, encouraging when possible. This was the hour when labor gave way to conversation, when the bonds of family and community were strengthened not through work, but through shared words and shared food. Even outside the cottages, the village was transformed. The lanes, so busy with feet and carts by day, grew quiet, though not silent. Dogs barked occasionally, chasing unseen shadows. The bell of the church might toll the evening hour, its voice carrying solemnly across fields and roofs. Neighbors still called to one another over fences, exchanging quick words before retreating indoors. A few figures lingered in doorways, watching the fading light, their arms folded, their breath misting as the night deepened. Children's laughter drifted as they played a last game before being called inside, their footsteps pattering across the dirt until silence reclaimed the lane. The sounds of evening were different from those of day. The clang of tools was gone, replaced by the softer crackle of fire, the occasional hiss of steam, the murmur of voices. Crickets began their steady song, owls hooted from the forest edge, the wind sighed through the trees. These sounds did not signal labor but rest, a settling of the world into its nocturnal rhythm. To lie on a pallet at this hour, listening, was to hear the village breathe, slow, deep, steady, like a body slipping into sleep. Tasks, however, did not vanish entirely. Women mended clothes by firelight, their needles flashing as they repaired worn hems and patched holes. Men sometimes sharpened tools for the next day, their whetstones rasping quietly. Children wound wool into balls, fetched water for the morning, or helped tidy the room. These small labors were lighter than the day's toil, but no less important. They were the bridge between the heavy burdens of daylight and the quiet surrender of night. And then came the stories. As darkness wrapped the village, families drew closer to the hearth, and words flowed like streams. Elders recalled events of their youth, tales of winters survived, of floods endured, of neighbors long gone. Parents told simpler stories, often teaching through them, parables of cleverness, of hard work rewarded, of foolishness punished. Children listened wide-eyed, their imaginations lit by firelight, their dreams shaped by the voices of those they trusted. Sometimes songs were sung, simple tunes that everyone knew, their melodies filling the room with warmth as sure as the fire. These moments were as much a part of survival as bread or water, for they fed the spirit when the body was weary. Outside, the night deepened. The sky filled with stars, brighter than we can easily imagine now, each one sharp against the dark. The moon cast pale light across fields and cottages, silvering the roofs, glinting on puddles, stretching shadows long. The village lay wrapped in this quiet brilliance, its sounds hushed, its movements slowed. Those who ventured out at night did so carefully, carrying torches or lanterns, for the world beyond the cottages belonged to shadows, and every rustle of leaves might carry mystery. But most remained indoors, wrapped in blankets, comforted by the familiar rhythm of the fire and the presence of family near at hand. Evening in the medieval village was thus a time of balance. It was neither as labor-heavy as day nor as silent as night. It was the threshold, the place where exhaustion met renewal, where tasks gave way to rest, where solitude gave way to fellowship. It was in these hours that the village remembered itself not only as a collection of individuals, but as a community, each household glowing like a star in the greater constellation of the village. And so, as the final embers dimmed and sleep claimed the weary, the village gave itself to the night. The voices quieted, the animals settled, the fires banked. Yet beneath it all, the rhythm of life continued, steady and patient, waiting for the rooster's crow and the sun's rise to call it once more into the labor and music of another day. And so, the day in the medieval village has run its full course. From the first faint glimmer of dawn across the fields to the hush of the silent night, life has unfolded not in sudden events, but in the steady rhythm of necessity. It has been a cycle of labor and rest, of sound and silence, of gathering and dispersing. Nothing was wasted. Nothing was without meaning. Every small task, every voice, every gesture wove itself into the larger fabric of survival that we have walked through the morning, watching the hearth come alive with smoke and warmth, listening to children's footsteps patter across the lanes, hearing the chorus of animals calling for care. We have seen the fields, stretching outward, holding both promise and demand, their furrows turned by patient hands and sturdy beasts. We have stood in the workshops, watching sparks rise from the blacksmith's hammer, curls of wood fall from the carpenter's plane, threads tightened on the loom. We have wandered the market square, crowded with voices and colors, where exchange and conversation made the village whole as the day waned. We have felt the shift into evening, animals gathered safely, doors closing, fires rekindled, meals shared. We have sat by the hearth at night, listening to stories carried across generations, tales that taught, warned, and comforted. And we have stepped into the silent night, where the stars burned bright and the village slept, its breath slow and steady, its heart secure in the quiet embrace of darkness. The medieval village was simple, but it was never empty. Its life was written not in great battles or grand monuments, but in the ordinary rhythm of days repeated, in the closeness of families, in the endurance of labor, in the continuity of memory. To look closely at that world is to realize that history is not only in kings and castles, but in the sweep of a broom, the hum of a spindle, the laughter of children, the murmur of voices by firelight. The day is over now, and the village rests. Tomorrow will begin again with the crow of a rooster, the creak of a door, the spark of a fire. But for now, in this quiet, let us rest with it. Let us close our eyes, breathe deeply, and find peace in the timeless rhythm of ordinary lives that, though long past, still echo gently across the centuries.